All right, give me just a second. Are we live? Hold on. Alrighty, and we are live. Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. I am Mikhail the Stray Cat, and we're going to pick up on Chapter 4 of Thomas Sowell's Basic Economics, where we left off in the last segment earlier. So without further ado, incentives versus goals. Incentives matter because most people will usually do more for their own benefit than for the benefit of others. Incentives link the two concerns together. A waitress brings food to your table not because of your hunger, but because her salary and tips depend on it. In the absence of such incentives, service in restaurants in the Soviet Union was notoriously bad. Unsold goods piling up in warehouses were not the only consequences of a lack of the incentives that come with a free market price system. Prices not only help determine which particular things are produced, they are also one of the ways of rationing the inherent scarcity of all goods and services, as well as rationing the scarce resources that go into producing those goods and services. However, prices do not create that scarcity, which will require some form of rationing under any other economic system. Simple as all this may seem, it goes counter to many policies and programs designed to make various goods and services affordable, or to keep them from becoming prohibitively expensive. But being prohibitive is precisely how prices limit how much each person uses. If everything were made affordable by government decree, there would still not be any more to go around than when things were prohibitively expensive. There would simply have to be some alternative method of rationing the inherent scarcity. Whether that method was through the government's issuing ration coupons, the emergence of black markets, or just fighting over things when they go on sale. That sounds familiar. The rationing would still have to be done, since artificially making things affordable does not create any more total output. On the contrary, price ceilings tend to cause less output to be produced. Many apparently humanitarian policies have backfired throughout history because of a failure to understand the role of prices. Attempts to keep food prices down by imposing price controls have led to hunger and even starvation, whether in 17th century Italy, 18th century India, France after the French Revolution, Russia after the Bolshevik Revolution, or in a number of African countries after they obtained independence during the 1960s. Some of these African countries, like some of the countries in Eastern Europe, once had such an abundance of food that they were food exporters before the era of price control and government planning turned them into countries unable to feed themselves. Failure to supply goods as a result of government restrictions must be sharply distinguished from an inability to produce them. Food can be in short supply in a country with extraordinary soil, as in post-communist Russia that had not yet achieved a free market economy. Quote, undulating through pastoral hills 150 miles south of Moscow, the Plava River Valley is a farmer's dream come true. This is the gateway to what Russians call, and I'm going to butcher this, Chernozem, Black Earth country, which boasts some of the most fertile soil in Europe within 3 hours' drive of a giant hungry metropolis. Black Earth country has the natural wealth to feed an entire nation, but it can barely feed itself. Unquote. It is hard even to imagine in a free market economy a hungry city dependent on imports of foreign food when there is extraordinarily fertile farmland not far away. Yet the people on that very fertile farmland were as poor as the city dwellers were hungry. The workers harvesting that land earned the equivalent of about $10 a week, with even this small amount being paid in kind, sacks of potatoes or cucumbers, because of a lack of money. As the mayor of a town in this region said, quote, "We ought to be rich. We have wonderful soil. We have the scientific know-how. We have qualified people. But what does it add up to?" End of quote. If nothing else, it adds up to a reason for understanding economics as a means of achieving an efficient allocation of scarce resources which have alternative uses. All that was lacking in Russia was a market to connect the hungry city with the products of the fertile land and a government that would allow such a market to function freely. But in some places, local Russian officials forbade the movement of food across local boundary lines in order to assure low food prices within their own jurisdictions and therefore local political support for themselves. Again, it is necessary to emphasize that this was not a stupid policy from the standpoint of officials trying to gain local popularity with consumers by maintaining low food prices. This protected their political careers, however disastrous such policies were for the country as a whole. While systemic causation in a free market is, in one sense, impersonal, in the sense that its outcomes are not specifically predetermined by any given person, the market, is ultimately a way by which many people's individual personal desires are reconciled with those of other people. Too often, a false contrast is made between the impersonal marketplace and the supposedly compassionate policies of various government programs. But both systems face the same scarcity of resources, and both systems make choices within the constraints of that scarcity. The difference is that one system involves each individual making choices for himself or herself, while the other system involves a small number of people making choices for millions of others. Wow, that sounds oddly familiar, doesn't it? The mechanisms of the market are impersonal, but the choices made by individuals are as personal as choices made anywhere else. It may be fashionable for journalists to refer to, quote, "the whim of the marketplace," unquote, as if that were something different from the desires of people, just as it was once fashionable to advocate, quote, "production for use rather than profit," unquote, as if profits could be made by producing things that people cannot use or do not want to use. The real contrast is between choices made by individuals for themselves and choices made for them by others who presume to define what these individuals really need. Isn't that? Scarcity and competition. Scarcity means that everyone's desires cannot be satisfied completely, regardless of which particular economic system or government policy we choose, and regardless of whether an individual or a society is poor or prosperous, wise or foolish, noble or ignoble. Competition among people for scarce resources is inherent. It is not a question whether we like or dislike competition. Scarcity means that we do not have the option to choose whether or not to have an economy in which people compete. That is the only kind of economy that is possible, and our only choice is among the particular methods that can be used for that competition. Economic institutions. Most people may be unaware that they are competing when making purchases and simply see themselves as deciding how much of various things to buy at whatever prices they find. But scarcity ensures that they are competing with others, even if they are conscious only of weighing their own purchasing decisions against the amount of money they have available. One of the incidental benefits of competing and sharing through prices is that different people are not as likely to think of themselves as rivals, nor to develop the kinds of hostilities that rivalry can breed. For example, much the same labor and construction material needed to build a Protestant church could be used to build a Catholic church. But if a Protestant congregation is raising money to build a church for themselves, they are likely to be pretty much money they can raise and how much is needed for the kind of church they want. Construction prices may cause them to scale back some of their more elaborate plans in order to fit within the limits of what they can afford. But they are unlikely to blame Catholics, even though the competition of Catholics for the same construction materials makes their prices higher than otherwise. If instead the government were in the business of building churches and giving them to different religious groups, Protestants and Catholics would be explicit rivals for this largesse, and neither would have any financial incentive to cut back on their building plans to accommodate the other. Instead, each would have an incentive to make the case as strongly as possible for the full extent of their desires, to mobilize their followers politically to insist on getting what they want, and to resent any suggestion that they scale back their plans. The inherent scarcity of materials and labor would still limit what could be built, but the limit would now be imposed politically and would be seen by each as due to the rivalry of the other. The Constitution of the United States, of course, prevents the American government from building churches for religious groups, no doubt in order to prevent just such political rivalries and the bitterness and sometimes bloodshed to which such rivalries have led in other countries and in other times. The same economic principle, however, applies to groups that are not based on religion but on ethnicity, geographic regions, or age brackets. All are inherently competing for the same resources simply because these resources are scarce. However, competing indirectly by having to keep your demands within the limits of your own pocketbook is very different from seeing your desires for government benefits thwarted directly by the rival claims of some other group. Yeah, bit of a difference. The self-rationing created by prices not only tends to mean less social and political friction, but also more economic efficiency, since each individual knows his or her own preferences better than any third party can, and can therefore make incremental trade-offs that are more personally satisfying within the limits of the available resources. Rationing through pricing also limits the amount of each individual's claims on the output of others to what that individual's own productivity has created for others, and thereby earned as income. What price control, subsidies, or other substitutes for price allocation do is reduce the incentives for self-rationing. That is why people with minor ailments go to doctors when medical care is either free or heavily subsidized by the government, and why farmers receiving government subsidized projects grow crops requiring huge amounts of water, which they would never grow if they had to pay the full costs of that water themselves. Society as a whole always has to pay the full costs, regardless of what prices are or are not charged to individuals. When price controls make goods artificially cheaper, that allows greater self-indulgence by some, which means that less is left for others. Thus, many apartments occupied by just one person under rent control means that others have trouble finding a place to stay, even when they are perfectly willing and able to pay the current rent. Moreover, since rationing must take place with or without prices, this means that some form of non-price rationing becomes a substitute. Simply waiting until what you want becomes available has been a common form of non-price rationing. This can mean waiting in long lines at stores, as was common in the Soviet economy, or being put on a waiting list for surgery, as patients often are in countries where government-provided medical care is either free or heavily subsidized. Luck and corruption are other substitutes for price rationing. Whoever happens to be in a store when a new shipment of some product in short supply arrives can get the first opportunity to buy it, while people who happen to learn about it much later can find the coveted product all gone by the time they get there. In other cases, personal or political favoritism or bribery takes the place of luck in gaining preferential access, or formal rationing systems may replace favoritism with some one-size-fits-all policy administered by government agencies. However it is done, The rationing that is done by prices in market economies cannot be gotten rid of by getting rid of prices or by the government lowering the level of prices. Incremental substitution. As important as it is to understand the role of substitutions, it is also important to keep in mind that the efficient allocation of resources requires that these substitutions be incremental, not total. For example, one may believe that health is more important than entertainment, but, however reasonable that may sound as a general principle, no one really believes that having a 20-year supply of band-aids in the closet is more important than having to give up all music in order to pay for it. A price-coordinated economy facilitates incremental substitution, but political decision-making tends toward categorical priorities. That is, declaring one thing absolutely more important than another and creating laws and policies accordingly. Wow. Sounds kind of like healthcare. And a lot of other things. Just saying. When some political figure says that we need to set national priorities about one thing or another, what that amounts to is making A categorically more important than B. This is the opposite of incremental substitution, in which the value of each depends on how much of each we already have at the moment, and therefore on the changing amount of A that we are willing to give up in order to get more of B. This variation in the relative values of things can be so great as to convert something that is beneficial into something that is detrimental, or vice versa. For example, human beings cannot live without salt, fat, and cholesterol, but most Americans get so much of all three that their lifespan is reduced. Conversely, despite the many problems caused by alcohol, from fatal automobile accidents to deaths from cirrhosis of the liver, studies show that very modest amounts of alcohol have health benefits that can be life-saving. Asterisk. Men who drink either nothing alcoholic or just one drink per week had a reduction in cardiovascular disease when they increased their alcohol intake by from 1 to 6 drinks per week. However, among men who already averaged 7 or more alcoholic drinks per week, an increase in their drinking led to more cardiovascular disease, according to the Archives of Internal Medicine, September 25th, 2000 issue. The medical publication The Lancet reported that, quote, light to moderate alcohol consumption is associated with a reduced risk of dementia in individuals aged 55 years or older, unquote, in its January 26, 2002 issue. End of asterisk. Alcohol is not categorically good or bad. Whenever there are two things which each have some value, one cannot be categorically more valuable than another. A diamond may be worth much more than a penny, but enough pennies will be worth more than any diamond. That is why incremental trade-offs tend to produce better results than categorical priorities. There are chronic complaints about government red tape in countries around the world, but the creation of red tape is understandable in view of the incentives facing those who create government forms, rules, and requirements for innumerable activities that require official approval. Nothing is easier than thinking of additional requirements that might be useful in some way or other, at some time or other, and nothing is harder than remembering to ask the crucial incremental question, at what cost? People who are spending their own money are confronted with those costs at every turn, but people who are spending the taxpayers' money, or who are simply imposing uncounted costs on businesses, homeowners, and others, have no real incentives to even find out how much the additional costs are, much less to hold off adding requirements when the incremental costs threaten to become larger than the incremental benefits to those on whom those costs are imposed by the government. Red tape grows as a result. Any attempt to get rid of some of this red tape is likely to be countered by government officials who can point out what useful purpose these requirements may serve in some circumstances. but they are unlikely even to pose the question whether the incremental benefit exceeds the incremental costs. There are no incentives for them to look at things that way, nor are the media likely to. A New York Times article, for example, argued that there were few, if any, useless regulations, as if that was the relevant criterion. But neither individuals nor businesses are willing or able to pay for everything that is not useless when they are spending their own money. No doubt there are reasons, or at least rationales, for the many government regulations imposed on businesses in Italy, for example, but the real question is whether their costs exceeded their benefits. Quote, imagine you're an ambitious Italian entrepreneur trying to make a go of a new business. You know you will have to pay at least 2/3 of your employees' Social Security costs. You also know you're going to run into problems once you hire your 16th employee, since that will trigger provisions making it either impossible or very expensive to dismiss a staffer. But there's so much more. Once you hire employee 11, you must submit an annual self-assessment to the national authorities outlining every possible health and safety hazard to which your employees might be subject. These include stress that is work-related or caused by age, gender, and racial differences. You must also note all precautionary and individual measures to prevent risks, procedures to carry them out, the names of employees in charge of safety, as well as the physician whose presence is required for the assessment. By the time your firm hires its 51st worker, 7% of the payroll must be handicapped in some way. Once you hire your 101st employee, you must submit a report every 2 years on the gender dynamics within the company. This must include a tabulation of the men and women employed in each production unit, their functions and level within the company, details of compensation and benefits, and dates and reasons for recruitments, promotions, and transfers, as well as the estimated revenue impact. Yeah, kind of convoluted. At least I'd say. As of the time that this description of Italian labor laws appeared in the Wall Street Journal, the unemployed rate in Italy was 10% and the Italian economy was contracting rather than growing. Subsidies and taxes. Ideally, prices allow alternative users to compete for scarce resources in the marketplace. However, this competition is distorted to the extent that special taxes are put on some products or resources, but not on others. Or when some products or resources are subsidized by the government, but others are not. Prices charged to the consumers of such specially taxed or specially subsidized goods and services do not convey the real costs of producing them, and therefore do not lead to the same trade-offs as if they did. Yet there is always a political temptation to subsidize good things and tax bad things. However, when neither good things nor bad things are good or bad categorically, this prevents our finding out just how good or how bad any of these things is by letting people choose freely, uninfluenced by politically charged prices. People who want special taxes or subsidies for particular things seem not to understand that what they are really asking for is for the prices to misstate the relative scarcities of things and the relative values that the users of these things put on them. One of the factors in California's recurring water crises, for example, is that California's farmers' use of water is subsidized heavily. Farmers in California's Imperial Valley pay $15 for the same amount of water that costs $400 in Los Angeles. The net result is that agriculture, which accounts for less than 2% of the state's output, consumes 43% of its water. California farmers grow crops requiring great amounts of water, such as rice and cotton, in a very dry climate where such crops would never be grown if farmers had to pay the real costs of the water they use. Inspiring as it may be to some observers that California's arid lands have been enabled to produce vast amounts of fruits and vegetables with the aid of subsidized water, those same fruits and vegetables could be produced more cheaply elsewhere with water supplied free of charge from the clouds. The way to tell whether the California produce is worth what it costs to grow is to allow all those costs to be paid by California farmers who compete with farmers in other states that have higher rainfall levels. There is no need for government officials to decide arbitrarily and categorically whether it is a good thing or a bad thing for particular crops to be grown in California with water artificially supplied below cost from federal irrigation projects. Such questions can be decided incrementally by those directly confronting the alternatives through price competition in a free market. California is unfortunately not unique in this respect. In fact, this is not a peculiarly, American problem. Halfway around the world, the government of India provides almost free electricity and water to farmers, according to The Economist magazine, encouraging farmers to plant too much water-guzzling rice, with the result that water tables in the Punjab are dropping fast. Making anything artificially cheap usually means that it will be wasted, whatever that thing might be and wherever it might be located. From the standpoint of the allocation of resources, government should either not tax resources, goods, and services, or else tax them all equally, so as to minimize the distortions of choices made by consumers and producers. I'd say not tax them at all, but that's just me. For similar reasons, particular resources, goods, and services should not be subsidized, even if particular people are subsidized out of humanitarian concern over their being the victims of natural disasters, birth defects, or other misfortunes beyond their control. Giving poor people money would accomplish the same humanitarian purpose without the same distortion in the allocation of resources created by subsidizing or taxing different products differently. However much economic efficiency would be promoted by letting resource prices be unchanged by taxes or subsidies, from a political standpoint, politicians win votes by doing special favors for special interests or putting special taxes on whomever or whatever might be unpopular at the moment. The free market may work best when there is a level playing field, but politicians win more votes by tilting the playing field to favor particular groups. Often, this process is rationalized politically in terms of a need to help the less fortunate, but once the power and the practice are established, they provide the means of subsidizing all sorts of groups who are not the least bit unfortunate. For example, the Wall Street Journal reported, quote, "A chunk of the federal taxes and fees paid by airline passengers are awarded to small airports used mainly by private pilots and globe-trotting corporate executives." Unquote. Isn't that interesting? All right, we will leave it there and we will pick this back up here after a little bit. Until then, live free or die trying.